When we moved into Brookstone Ridge, everything looked perfect in a way that felt unnatural. The lawns were trimmed to identical heights, the houses wore the same muted colors, and even the mailboxes seemed aligned with mathematical precision. Neighbors smiled as we passed, but the smiles felt rehearsed, practiced, like they were part of an unspoken rulebook. I had spent most of my adult life working as a municipal compliance auditor, and experience had taught me one simple truth: when a place looks too controlled, someone is usually abusing that control. Brookstone Ridge had an HOA, and that alone set off alarms in my head, though at the time I tried to ignore them. The moving truck had barely finished parking when she appeared. She emerged from across the street as if summoned by the sound of the engine, clipboard tucked under her arm, pearls resting against a perfectly pressed blouse. Her smile was wide and unwavering, the kind that never quite reached the eyes. She introduced herself as Karen Hollis, the HOA president, and welcomed us with a handshake that lingered just a second too long. Her gaze drifted past me, scanning the truck, the driveway, the house, and finally landing on my wife, Emily, who stood in the doorway with one hand resting protectively on her 8-month pregnant belly. Karen's eyes paused there before she spoke again, explaining that the HOA liked to meet new residents immediately to ensure everything started correctly. The word carried weight, like a warning wrapped in politeness. Later that afternoon, a thick binder appeared on our porch. It wasn't a welcome packet or a friendly introduction. It was a 300-page rulebook, complete with color-coded tabs and highlighted sections. Karen rang the doorbell just as I began flipping through it, casually pointing out rules as if she'd memorized every page. She informed me that moving trucks weren't allowed to block driveways for more than 30 minutes. I told her it had only been 12. Her smile twitched, barely noticeable, and she wrote something down anyway. That was the moment I noticed Emily gripping the doorframe, her face tight with discomfort. Karen glanced at her again and remarked that pregnant residents were also expected to follow community standards. Emily went pale, and something in my chest tightened. 2 days later, our first violation notice arrived. Karen had photographed my car parked in our own driveway and cited it for improper angle placement, claiming it disrupted visual symmetry. I laughed when I read it, convinced it had to be a mistake. It wasn't. There was a $75 fine attached. When I mentioned it to the neighbor next door, his expression shifted instantly. He told me not to argue with Karen, lowering his voice as if she might hear. He said she kept files on everyone. That night, Emily cried quietly in bed, the kind of tears that come from exhaustion and fear rather than anger. She told me Karen kept staring at her like she was a problem that needed solving. I held her hand and promised I wouldn't let anyone touch her or the baby, even though I wasn't yet sure how far this situation could go. A week later, a medical delivery arrived at our home. It was a portable monitoring unit prescribed by Emily's doctor due to complications in her pregnancy. The box had barely been set inside when Karen appeared again, as if she were watching the house. She demanded to know what the equipment was and insisted that medical devices required HOA approval before placement. I told her it was temporary and medically necessary. She replied that fines were temporary too and photographed the box without asking. Emily sat down heavily, her breathing shallow, and in that moment I realized Karen wasn't enforcing rules for order. She was collecting leverage. The HOA meeting that Thursday night confirmed my suspicion. The room was filled with quiet tension, neighbors sitting stiffly in folding chairs while Karen stood at the front, completely at ease. She spoke at length about compliance, uniformity, and protecting property values, her eyes frequently flicking toward us. When Emily shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable, Karen paused mid-sentence to remind everyone that personal circumstances did not override community standards. The silence that followed was heavy, but no one spoke up. I saw fear in their faces, the kind that grows when authority goes unchecked for too long. As we drove home that night, Emily rested her head against the window and whispered that she didn't feel safe. Not in the physical sense, but in the way that eats at you slowly, the sense that someone is watching and waiting for a mistake. I told her we'd get through it, that I knew how systems like this worked. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't done. People like her never stop at one warning or one fine. They escalate, carefully and deliberately, until resistance feels impossible. And standing there in that perfectly manicured neighborhood, I realized we hadn't just moved into a new house. We had walked straight into a power struggle that was only just beginning. The days after that first HOA meeting settled into an uneasy rhythm. Every morning I stepped outside with the same feeling I used to get before audits went sideways, the sense that something invisible was already moving against me. Karen didn't come by in person anymore, but her presence was everywhere. Violation notices appeared with mechanical regularity, slid into our mailbox or taped neatly to the door as if delivered by a machine rather than a person. One was for trash cans being visible 15 minutes past the approved window. Another cited unapproved exterior decor, referring to a small wooden bench Emily liked to sit on when the swelling in her feet became too much. Each notice carried a fine, modest on its own, but stacking quickly, like pressure building behind a dam. Emily's doctor warned us that stress was becoming a real risk. Her blood pressure crept higher each visit, and she was ordered to limit movement even further. That made Karen's next move feel less like coincidence and more like calculation. One afternoon, as I helped Emily from the car, a white HOA enforcement vehicle rolled slowly past our driveway, paused, and then reversed. Karen stepped out, clipboard in hand, eyes immediately locking onto the temporary handrail I'd installed beside the front steps. It was a simple metal rail, bolted securely, installed solely so Emily wouldn't fall. Karen circled it like an inspector at a crime scene, then informed me it violated aesthetic guidelines. When I explained it was medically necessary, she smiled and said medical necessity required documentation submitted 30 days in advance. Emily's hands shook as she leaned against me, and Karen took notes as if she were observing data rather than a human being. That evening, I filed a formal request for accommodation, attaching medical letters, doctor signatures, and legal references. I knew the law. HOAs were required to make reasonable accommodations for medical and disability-related needs. Karen acknowledged receipt within minutes, but the next morning another violation arrived anyway, this one for unauthorized modification pending review. It was clear now. The process itself was the punishment. Emily stopped sitting outside. She stopped opening the curtains. Every sound from the street made her flinch. The house, meant to be a refuge, began to feel like a monitored zone. Neighbors noticed, but fear kept them distant. One woman slipped Emily a note at the mailbox, apologizing for Karen's behavior and warning us that fighting back only made things worse. Another neighbor quietly admitted Karen had forced him to remove a wheelchair ramp for his mother years earlier, right before she passed. He told me Karen had called it an eyesore. Listening to these stories, a pattern emerged, one I recognized all too well from my career. Karen thrived on selective enforcement. She didn't care about the rules themselves, only about who she could use them against. And now, we were her project. The real turning point came the morning Emily slipped. It wasn't dramatic, not at first. She was stepping carefully down the front steps, holding the doorframe because we'd temporarily removed the handrail after another warning. Her foot missed the edge by half an inch. She caught herself before falling, but the jolt sent her into immediate pain. By the time I got her inside, she was crying and struggling to breathe evenly. We spent the rest of the day in the hospital, doctors monitoring her and the baby for signs of distress. They stabilized her, but the message was clear. One more incident like that could have serious consequences. When we returned home that night, exhausted and shaken, a bright orange notice was taped to the door. Karen had cited us for failing to remove the handrail within the allotted compliance window. I stood there holding the paper, hospital bracelet still on Emily's wrist, and something inside me finally snapped into place. Fear gave way to clarity. Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was a liability. And liabilities, if documented properly, could be neutralized. I began keeping records. Every notice, every email, every photograph Karen took of our property. I installed discrete cameras, legally placed, covering the driveway and front yard. I logged times, dates, and patterns. And the patterns were damning. Karen's enforcement visits coincided with Emily being outside. Her notices spiked after medical deliveries or doctor visits. This wasn't random. It was targeted. The more I documented, the calmer I became, because systems like hers collapse under scrutiny. They always do. Karen, however, seemed emboldened. At the next HOA meeting, she presented our home as an example of non-compliance that threatens community standards. She spoke calmly, confidently, as if describing a structural defect rather than a pregnant woman on medical restriction. When I stood and cited federal accommodation laws, the room shifted uncomfortably. Karen responded by reminding everyone that Brookstone Ridge was a private community with its own governing documents. Her confidence was absolute, and I could tell she believed it. People like Karen often do, right up until the moment they're forced to confront evidence. That night, Emily asked me a question I hadn't expected. She asked what would happen if Karen didn't stop. I told her the truth. I said people who rely on power instead of fairness eventually expose themselves. Emily nodded, resting a hand on her belly, and whispered that she just wanted our child to come into a world where people were kind. I promised her I would make sure that happened, at least in our corner of it. What I didn't say out loud was that Karen had already crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She just didn't know it yet. Because while Karen believed she was tightening control, she was actually creating a record. And records, when placed in the right hands, have a way of turning predators into defendants. As I shut off the lights that night and checked the cameras one last time, I saw Karen's car slow as it passed our house. She glanced toward our windows, satisfied, certain she was winning. I let her believe it. The most dangerous moment for someone like Karen is when they think they're untouchable. And she was getting very close to that moment. The week after Emily's hospital visit felt heavier than anything we had experienced so far. The air inside the house itself seemed tense, as if the walls had absorbed the stress and were holding onto it. Emily moved slowly, carefully, following the doctor's orders, but even the smallest tasks left her exhausted. I took over everything I could, cooking, cleaning, handling calls, trying to keep life as calm as possible. Calm, however, was not something Karen intended to allow. She stopped pretending her actions were routine enforcement and began leaning fully into intimidation, cloaking it in paperwork and procedure. It started with certified letters. Thick envelopes arrived almost daily, each one stamped and formal, outlining continued non-compliance and escalating fines. Karen referenced bylaws in dense legal language, clearly designed to overwhelm rather than inform. She accused us of creating safety hazards, lowering property values, and even fostering community disharmony. The irony of that last accusation almost made me laugh, except there was nothing funny about watching my wife flinch every time the mail truck stopped outside. Emily stopped opening the letters altogether. She couldn't bear to read them anymore, and I didn't force her. That became my role, absorbing the pressure so she didn't have to. Karen escalated further by involving third parties. One afternoon, a city code enforcement officer knocked on our door. He was polite, almost apologetic, explaining he'd received a complaint about unpermitted exterior modifications. I showed him the handrail, the medical documentation, and the emails. He sighed, quietly admitted the complaint shouldn't have been forwarded, and left without issuing a citation. But the damage was done. Karen had learned she could summon authority with a phone call, even if it didn't stick. The message was clear: she could make our lives complicated whenever she wanted. The next move was more personal. Karen began speaking to neighbors openly about us, no longer hiding behind notices. I overheard her one afternoon while working in the garage. She stood on the sidewalk with two women from the block, gesturing toward our house and shaking her head. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught phrases like refuses to cooperate and thinks rules don't apply to them. When she noticed me watching, she smiled, waved, and continued talking as if I weren't standing 10 feet away. Emily heard it too. She sat down hard on the couch afterward, staring at nothing, and said she felt like everyone was watching her, judging her for being pregnant, for being vulnerable, for existing. The stress began affecting the baby. Emily experienced contractions that sent us back to the hospital, this time for overnight monitoring. Lying in that sterile room, listening to machines hum softly in the dark, she asked me what we'd done to deserve this. I told her the truth. We'd done nothing wrong. We had simply crossed paths with someone who saw compassion as weakness and control as virtue. Karen thrived on compliance, but more than that, she thrived on fear. And fear was exactly what she was trying to cultivate in us. While Emily slept, I sat by the window and reviewed my records. The timeline was undeniable. Karen's actions intensified whenever Emily's condition became more visible. She cited us for the bench the day after Emily sat outside for longer than usual. She sent notices after medical deliveries. She complained about the handrail only after Emily nearly fell. This wasn't coincidence. It was retaliation. And retaliation, when documented, transformed a private nuisance into a legal liability. I began reaching out quietly. First, to a fair housing advocate I'd worked with years earlier. Then to a disability rights attorney who specialized in HOA abuse cases. I didn't tell Emily yet. I didn't want to give her false hope or add more stress. I needed to be certain before I acted. Each professional I spoke to reacted the same way. Silence at first, then anger. They told me Karen's behavior was not just unethical, but potentially illegal. More importantly, they told me this kind of person rarely stopped on their own. They stopped only when exposed. Karen seemed to sense something shifting. She became bolder, less careful. One evening, she knocked on our door without warning. I opened it to find her standing too close, her smile tight and practiced. She informed me that the HOA board would be voting on a motion to impose daily fines until all violations were resolved. When I asked which violations she meant, she waved her hand vaguely toward the house. "All of them," she said. I told her any further communication should be in writing. Her eyes hardened for a split second before the smile returned. She leaned in slightly and said she hoped the stress wouldn't be too much for Emily in her condition. That was the moment I knew she was no longer just abusing authority. She was enjoying it. After she left, Emily broke down completely. Not loud, dramatic sobs, but the quiet kind that come from feeling trapped. She said she felt like she was being punished for being pregnant, for needing help, for not fitting into Karen's idea of perfection. I held her and told her we were done being silent. I told her there were laws that protected us, and people who would enforce them. She listened, nodded, but I could see fear lingering in her eyes. Trauma doesn't disappear just because justice is possible. The following HOA meeting was worse than the last. Karen arrived early, stacking papers neatly, commanding the room before the meeting even began. She opened by presenting a financial report that subtly emphasized how non-compliant properties drained HOA resources. She didn't use our names, but she didn't need to. Everyone knew. When I stood to speak, she tried to cut me off, citing time limits. I ignored her and calmly read excerpts from federal fair housing law, specifically the sections on reasonable accommodations for medical conditions. Murmurs spread through the room. Karen's face tightened, and she quickly adjourned the meeting, claiming procedural violations. Afterward, a few neighbors approached me quietly. One man admitted Karen had fined him repeatedly after he questioned her budget. Another woman said Karen had threatened to report her adult son for zoning violations if she didn't fall in line. The stories poured out in whispers, fear still evident, but something else mixed in now. Hope. Karen's authority depended on isolation. The moment people realized they weren't alone, the cracks began to show. That night, I received an email from Karen that crossed another line. She suggested that if Emily's condition made compliance difficult, perhaps Brookstone Ridge wasn't the right environment for our family. The implication was unmistakable. She was hinting at forcing us out. I forwarded the email to the attorney immediately. His response came back short and decisive. She just made a very big mistake. Emily went into early labor the next morning. It was stopped in time, but the doctors were blunt. Stress was the trigger. Any more incidents could put both her and the baby at serious risk. Sitting beside her hospital bed, watching her breathe shallowly, I felt a controlled fury settle in. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules anymore. She was endangering lives. And that transformed this from a dispute into a fight I was no longer willing to lose quietly. When we returned home, I installed additional cameras and began preparing formal complaints. Not just to the HOA, but to state regulators, housing authorities, and the press if necessary. Karen believed her position insulated her from consequences. She believed paperwork protected her. But paperwork cuts both ways. And the more she escalated, the more evidence she handed me. As I watched the live feed from the driveway that night, Karen's car passed again, slowing just long enough for her to glance toward our house. This time, I didn't feel dread. I felt certainty. She had pushed too far, and she had done it in writing, on camera, and in front of witnesses. Karen thought part one of this story belonged to her. She was wrong. She had only written the opening chapter. And she had no idea how the rest of it would end. The night Emily returned from the hospital, Brookstone Ridge felt different to me. The neighborhood lights glowed the same warm yellow, the sidewalks were just as clean, and the houses sat in their neat rows like always, but the illusion of calm was gone. Once you see how control works behind the scenes, you can never unsee it. Emily slept restlessly, one hand curled protectively over her stomach, while I sat at the kitchen table reviewing documents until dawn. Medical reports, violation notices, emails, timestamps, camera footage. Karen's name appeared everywhere, threaded through our lives like a poison ivy vine, creeping and persistent. By morning, the HOA struck again. This time it wasn't a fine. It was a notice of intent. Karen had scheduled a special board review to determine whether our property posed an ongoing compliance risk to the community. The language was vague but deliberate. It gave her room to maneuver, to claim authority without stating it outright. Emily read the notice once and pushed it away, whispering that she felt like they were trying to erase us. I told her she wasn't wrong. Karen wasn't trying to fix violations. She was trying to force us out without saying the words. The review was scheduled for the following week. Mandatory attendance. Failure to appear would be treated as admission of non-compliance. I took the day off work and arranged for Emily's doctor to be on standby, just in case. The night before the meeting, Karen sent one more email. It was short, polite on the surface, but unmistakably threatening beneath. She suggested that selling the house before the review might be less stressful for everyone involved, especially given Emily's condition. I stared at the screen for a long time before forwarding it to our attorney. His reply came back within minutes. Save everything. This is coercion. The morning of the review, neighbors gathered in the clubhouse with the same tight expressions I'd seen before, but this time something had shifted. Word had spread. Karen's tactics were no longer rumors whispered in driveways. People had started comparing notes. I could see it in the way they avoided Karen's eyes, in the way they watched her instead of listening. She stood at the front of the room, composed as ever, papers stacked neatly, confidence radiating from her posture. Emily sat beside me, pale but resolute, holding my hand tightly. Karen opened the meeting by listing our alleged violations, speaking calmly, clinically, as if she were reading a weather report. She referenced aesthetics, uniformity, and community impact, carefully avoiding any mention of Emily's medical condition. When she finished, she looked at us expectantly, as though she'd already decided the outcome. I stood slowly and began speaking, not loudly, not angrily, but clearly. I explained Emily's medical situation, the doctor's orders, and the accommodations we had requested. Then I did something Karen hadn't expected. I projected a timeline onto the screen behind her, showing every notice, every fine, every email, aligned with Emily's medical events. The room went quiet. Karen turned, her smile faltering for the first time. I continued, explaining the legal obligations of the HOA under fair housing laws, and how selective enforcement constituted discrimination. I read aloud Karen's own emails, including the one suggesting we sell our home. I could see the board members shifting uncomfortably. Karen tried to interrupt, claiming procedural violations, but I didn't stop. I showed footage from our cameras, timestamps proving Karen's repeated surveillance. I showed records of neighbors who had been fined after questioning her authority. One by one, her narrative unraveled. Then something unexpected happened. A neighbor stood up. Then another. Then another. Stories poured out. A disabled spouse forced to remove a ramp. A grieving family fined for leaving flowers out too long. A single mother threatened with legal action over a cracked driveway. Karen's face tightened with each account, her authority shrinking in real time. She tried to regain control, raising her voice, insisting she was only enforcing the rules, but the room had turned against her. For the first time, she was outnumbered. Emily squeezed my hand, tears streaming down her face, but this time they weren't from fear. They were from relief. The truth had finally been spoken out loud. Karen called for a recess, claiming the board needed time to deliberate. People didn't leave. They stood in small groups, talking openly now, anger replacing fear. Karen retreated to a corner, phone pressed to her ear, her expression sharp and calculating. I watched her, knowing she was already planning her next move. That move came sooner than expected. 2 days later, an official-looking envelope arrived from the HOA's legal counsel. It accused us of defamation, disruption, and violating confidentiality by presenting internal communications. It demanded we cease all action immediately. Our attorney laughed when he read it. He told me Karen was panicking. Lawsuits like that were meant to scare, not win. More importantly, he told me state regulators had already opened an inquiry based on the documentation we'd submitted. Karen didn't know that yet. She didn't know investigators were reviewing her enforcement patterns. She didn't know neighbors were preparing formal complaints. She didn't know that the HOA's insurance carrier had been alerted to potential liability. She believed she could still intimidate her way out. That belief drove her final escalation in part 1. One evening, as Emily rested inside, I noticed Karen standing across the street, phone raised, filming our house. I stepped outside and calmly asked her to leave our property alone. She smiled and said she was documenting ongoing violations. When I told her she was trespassing, her smile vanished. She stepped closer and said quietly that people like us didn't last long in Brookstone Ridge. That was the first time she dropped the mask entirely. I recorded every word. That night, Emily went into labor again. This time, it didn't stop. As we rushed to the hospital, sirens echoing behind us, I felt a cold clarity settle in. Karen's actions had consequences now, consequences that could no longer be contained within HOA paperwork. As Emily was taken into the delivery room, a nurse asked what had caused the stress. I told her the truth. An HOA president who thought rules mattered more than human life. Our child arrived early but alive. Fragile, small, fighting. As I held my newborn for the first time, I made a vow. Karen Hollis would never again be allowed to hide behind bylaws and binders. She had pushed too far, hurt too deeply, and left too much evidence behind. Part 1 ended not with her victory, but with a reckoning set into motion. Because while Karen believed she was the authority in Brookstone Ridge, the real authorities were finally paying attention. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm linen, a strange mix that clung to my clothes even after hours had passed. Emily lay propped against pillows, pale but awake, her eyes fixed on the tiny bundle sleeping in the clear bassinet beside her bed. Our son was small, far smaller than he should have been, his chest rising and falling in quick, determined breaths. The doctors said he was stable, but every sentence came with conditions and cautions. Stress had accelerated everything. That truth sat heavy in my chest, because I knew exactly where that stress had come from. Karen didn't wait long to remind us she existed. While Emily and the baby remained under observation, my phone began filling with notifications. Emails from the HOA. Messages marked urgent. Karen framed them as administrative necessities, but the timing was cruelly precise. She referenced the missed compliance review, despite knowing we were in the hospital, and warned that unresolved violations could trigger emergency board action. I forwarded everything to our attorney without responding. Silence, in this case, was strategy. Neighbours began visiting the hospital quietly, one by one. Some brought food. Some brought cards. Others brought stories. A man told me Karen had once fined him while his wife was in chemo. A woman whispered that Karen had threatened to call child services over toys left in her yard. Each story reinforced the same pattern. Karen used moments of vulnerability as leverage. She didn't just enforce rules, she exploited weakness. And now, that pattern was documented not just by me, but by half the neighborhood. 2 days after the birth, state investigators contacted me directly. They said they were reviewing complaints regarding Brookstone Ridge HOA, specifically allegations of discriminatory enforcement and abuse of authority. They asked for records. I sent everything. Timelines, emails, footage, witness statements. The investigator paused at one point and asked a question that chilled me. Did the HOA president know about your wife's medical condition before these actions escalated? I answered honestly, yes. She knew. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before the investigator thanked me and said they'd be in touch. Karen, meanwhile, was spiraling. Her emails became erratic, less polished. She demanded immediate inspections. She threatened legal action. She accused us of conspiring to undermine the HOA. Each message contradicted the last. It was the behavior of someone losing control, and control was the only thing Karen had ever valued. She didn't realize yet that every frantic message only strengthened the case against her. When Emily and the baby were discharged, we returned home cautiously. Neighbors had decorated our porch with small ribbons and a handmade sign welcoming the baby. It was the first time the house felt warm again. That warmth didn't last long. As I carried the baby inside, Karen stood across the street, arms crossed, watching. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply stared, her jaw tight, her eyes calculating. It was the look of someone deciding how far they were willing to go. That night, under cover of darkness, the HOA posted a notice on our door declaring our property under compliance review lockdown. It restricted exterior movement, prohibited temporary structures, and demanded immediate removal of unapproved installations. The notice was unsigned, but I knew who authored it. Emily read it once and laughed weakly, a sound halfway between disbelief and exhaustion. "She's still doing this," she whispered. I nodded. Karen wasn't backing down. She was doubling down. The following morning, Karen made her boldest move yet. She showed up with a locksmith. She claimed the HOA had authority to disable access to non-compliant properties pending review. It was nonsense, legally indefensible nonsense, but she said it confidently, loudly, in front of neighbors. When I stepped outside with my phone recording, she snapped that filming violated HOA policy. I told her trespassing violated state law. The locksmith hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Karen pressured him anyway. When I told him there was a newborn inside and demanded he leave, he did. Karen screamed after him, furious, humiliated in public. That humiliation marked a turning point. Karen no longer cared about subtlety. She cared about revenge. By afternoon, rumors spread that the HOA would vote to revoke our residency privileges. The phrase was meaningless, but the intent was clear. Karen wanted us gone, and she wanted the neighborhood to believe it was justified. What she didn't know was that multiple neighbors had already contacted investigators directly, corroborating our claims. She also didn't know that the HOA's insurance provider had opened a risk assessment file. People like Karen never imagine the quiet consequences until they arrive all at once. Late that evening, as Emily fed the baby, my phone rang again. It was the investigator. He told me they would be conducting on-site interviews the following week. He also told me, very carefully, that retaliation against complainants was a serious offense. I thanked him and hung up, feeling something close to relief for the first time in weeks. Karen's retaliation came anyway. She filed an emergency injunction against us the next day, accusing us of harassment, defamation, and creating a hostile environment for HOA leadership. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so dangerous. Our attorney moved quickly, filing a counterclaim that included medical documentation linking Karen's actions to Emily's premature labor. That filing changed everything. The case was no longer about property aesthetics. It was about harm. Karen tried to regain public favor. She sent out a community-wide email framing herself as a victim, claiming she was being targeted for doing her job. But the responses didn't go the way she expected. People questioned her. Some openly challenged her authority. Others demanded transparency. The board, once silent, began distancing themselves. Karen had ruled through fear, and once fear cracked, loyalty vanished with it. One afternoon, I found a note taped to our door. It wasn't from the HOA. It was handwritten, shaky. It said simply, "I'm sorry we didn't speak up sooner." I didn't know who left it, but I understood what it meant. Karen's power depended on isolation. Isolation was gone. As Part 2 continued, Karen would make one final attempt to reassert control, an attempt so reckless it would seal her fate. But in this moment, standing in our living room with our newborn asleep against Emily's chest, I felt something I hadn't felt since we moved in. Not safety yet, but momentum. The kind that builds when truth finally has witnesses. Karen thought she was fighting a family. She was actually fighting exposure. The days following Karen's failed locksmith stunt unfolded like a slow unraveling. On the surface, Brookstone Ridge looked unchanged, but beneath the manicured lawns and synchronized trash schedules, tension pulsed through every interaction. Neighbors lingered longer at mailboxes, conversations hushed but urgent. Karen's car still cruised the street, but it no longer inspired the same reflexive silence. People watched now. They noticed. And Karen noticed that they noticed. Emily tried to settle into a fragile routine with the baby. Feedings, naps, short moments of quiet that felt precious and temporary. Yet even these were interrupted by the constant thrum of anxiety. Each email notification made her flinch. Each knock at the door made her heart race. I shielded her as best I could, intercepting mail, silencing my phone, coordinating with our attorney in the background. Still, Karen found ways to intrude, as if she could sense calm and felt compelled to crush it. She began issuing community updates almost daily, long-winded emails masquerading as transparency. In them, she framed ongoing investigations as misunderstandings and painted herself as a leader under siege. She emphasized unity while subtly warning against spreading misinformation. The tactic was familiar. Control the narrative, then punish dissent. But the effect was different this time. Replies came back questioning her claims. Some asked why accommodations were denied. Others asked about finances, enforcement disparities, and legal exposure. Karen responded curtly, defensively, her tone sharpening with each exchange. The board members started skipping meetings. One resigned quietly, citing personal reasons. Another stopped responding to Karen's messages altogether. She compensated by consolidating power, scheduling emergency sessions, and issuing unilateral directives. It was a classic mistake. The tighter she gripped, the faster everything slipped. Investigators arrived on a Wednesday morning. 2 of them. Calm, professional, and methodical. They walked the neighborhood, interviewed residents, reviewed records, and requested access to HOA files. Karen hovered nearby, offering explanations no one asked for, her voice pitched just a bit too high. When they asked to see enforcement logs, she hesitated. When they asked for emails, she deflected. The investigators noted everything. They always do. That afternoon, one of them knocked on our door. He asked about Emily's condition, about the timing of events, about Karen's comments and actions. Emily spoke quietly but clearly, describing the fear, the stress, the sense of being targeted. When she finished, the investigator thanked her and said something that stayed with me. "Patterns matter," he said. "And this pattern is very clear." Karen responded the only way she knew how, by escalating again. She filed additional violations, this time for alleged noise disturbances. The baby's crying. She cited quiet hours and demanded sound mitigation. When I read the notice, I felt a cold calm settle in. The cruelty of it was so blatant it crossed into absurdity. Our attorney advised us not to respond directly. "Let her hang herself with paperwork," he said. The next HOA meeting was chaos. Karen attempted to run it as usual, but residents interrupted her, demanding answers. Someone asked about the investigation. Someone else asked about legal costs. Karen snapped, accused them of insubordination, and threatened fines. That threat broke whatever remained of her authority. Voices rose. People stood. One man openly accused her of abuse. Karen banged her gavel so hard it cracked. She adjourned the meeting abruptly and stormed out, her composure shattered. Within days, the HOA's insurance carrier sent a letter to the board. Coverage would be suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. That letter circulated quickly. Panic followed. Without insurance, the HOA was exposed. Lawsuits that once felt theoretical now felt imminent. Board members began calling residents, trying to calm fears, trying to distance themselves from Karen's decisions. Karen, in turn, blamed everyone else. She showed up at our house again, this time alone. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. She demanded to speak to me privately. I told her all communication should go through counsel. She leaned closer, her voice low and venomous, and said she would make sure we regretted this. I recorded every word. She noticed and smiled thinly, as if daring me to use it. That night, an anonymous email circulated through the neighborhood. It contained screenshots. Karen's emails. Her directives. Her comments about problem residents. It wasn't from me. It didn't need to be. The truth had escaped containment. People began responding publicly, condemning her actions, sharing their own experiences. Karen tried to shut it down, threatened legal action against unknown parties, but the damage was irreversible. Emily watched it unfold from the couch, the baby asleep on her chest. She looked exhausted, but lighter somehow, as if a weight had shifted. "She's losing," she whispered. I nodded. Karen was losing control of the narrative, and that was the beginning of the end. The investigators returned for follow-up interviews. This time, Karen wasn't present. She claimed illness. The board members, left without her, answered questions nervously, often contradicting her earlier statements. Those contradictions were noted. Paper trails don't lie, but people under pressure often do. By the end of the week, a formal notice arrived from the state. The HOA was under review for discriminatory practices and abuse of authority. Karen was named explicitly. The board was instructed to preserve all records and cease retaliatory actions immediately. When Karen received that notice, she snapped. Her final move of Part 2 came late one evening. She attempted to enter our backyard, claiming an emergency inspection. Cameras caught everything. I confronted her calmly, told her to leave, reminded her of the investigation. She laughed and said no one would believe us anyway. Then she said something unforgivable. She implied that Emily's complications were her own fault for not fitting in. That clip was sent directly to investigators. By morning, Karen's emails stopped. Her car remained parked. Rumors flew. Some said she'd retained private counsel. Others said she was trying to resign quietly. None of it mattered anymore. The machinery of accountability had engaged, and once it does, it doesn't stop easily. As Part 2 moved forward, the question was no longer whether Karen would fall. It was how much damage she would cause on the way down, and whether the systems she abused would finally correct themselves, or simply replace her with someone smarter. The calm before the next storm settled over Brookstone Ridge, and for the first time since we moved in, I slept without fear. Not because the fight was over, but because it had finally shifted onto ground where truth had the advantage. Karen's silence lasted exactly 48 hours, long enough for hope to start forming in the quiet spaces she once dominated. The neighborhood breathed differently during that brief pause. People waved again. Cars slowed not out of suspicion but curiosity. Emily managed a small walk down the driveway with the baby bundled against her chest, and for the first time in weeks, no one photographed, no one hovered, no one wrote anything down. It felt almost unreal, like the calm before a storm that everyone sensed but no one named. Then Karen came back louder than ever. She resurfaced with a letter delivered to every home in Brookstone Ridge, printed on heavy paper with bold headings and legal jargon meant to intimidate. In it, she claimed the investigation was politically motivated, that outside agitators were manipulating residents, and that she would be temporarily assuming expanded authority to protect the integrity of the community. She framed it as sacrifice, as leadership under attack. But fear no longer landed the way it used to. People read the letter, compared notes, and saw the cracks. Karen was no longer speaking from a position of control. She was speaking from panic. The board attempted to intervene, scheduling an emergency closed-door session without Karen's approval. That alone told me how far things had shifted. Karen responded by locking them out of the HOA's shared digital records, changing passwords, and claiming sole custodianship of documents. It was a reckless move, one that crossed from abuse into obstruction. When the investigators learned of it, their tone changed. What had been a civil inquiry was now edging toward enforcement. Karen's behavior became erratic. She sent messages late at night, some rambling, others accusatory. In one, she warned that certain families were putting themselves at risk by cooperating with investigators. In another, she accused the neighborhood of betrayal. People stopped responding altogether. Isolation, once her weapon, had turned against her. Emily felt the shift too. She was still fragile, still healing, but the constant edge of fear dulled. She began sleeping longer stretches. The baby gained weight steadily, each ounce a quiet victory. Watching them, I felt both relief and resolve. Karen's actions had consequences far beyond inconvenience. They had nearly broken something precious. That reality fueled everything I did next. The investigators returned again, this time with requests Karen could not ignore. They demanded full access to HOA financials, enforcement logs, and communications. Karen delayed, citing procedural concerns. That delay triggered a subpoena. The word rippled through the neighborhood like electricity. Subpoena meant this was no longer something Karen could spin away with emails and speeches. Cornered, Karen made her most dangerous mistake. She attempted to manufacture evidence. One evening, a violation notice appeared on our door citing a hostile confrontation allegedly initiated by me. The notice referenced a written complaint from Karen herself, describing behavior that never happened. It accused me of threats, intimidation, and harassment. On paper, it looked official. In reality, it was fiction. And fiction is easy to dismantle when cameras exist. I forwarded the notice to our attorney and the investigators, along with footage proving Karen's claims were false. The response was swift. An investigator called me directly, his voice sharp and controlled. He asked if Karen had been informed of the ongoing inquiry when she filed the complaint. I said yes. There was a pause. Then he said, "That's very serious." Karen didn't stop there. She contacted Child Services anonymously, alleging that our home environment was unsafe due to ongoing disputes and excessive stress. The call was traced within hours. When the caseworker arrived, she reviewed our records, saw the baby healthy and cared for, and closed the file immediately. But the attempt itself crossed another line. Karen had weaponized institutions meant to protect people. That act stripped away any remaining sympathy. The neighborhood erupted. The anonymous email thread flared back to life, angrier now. Residents demanded Karen's resignation. Some threatened their own legal action if the HOA continued under her leadership. The board issued a public statement distancing themselves from Karen entirely, claiming she had acted without authorization. It was a weak attempt at damage control, but it marked a turning point. Karen was officially alone. Emily read the board statement quietly, then handed it back to me. She said she felt sad, not for Karen, but for how much harm one person could cause when given unchecked power. I agreed, but I also knew sadness wasn't the end of this story. Accountability was. Karen, sensing the collapse closing in, tried to disappear. Her car vanished from the street. Emails bounced back unanswered. Rumors spread that she'd hired an aggressive private attorney. Others said she was preparing to move. None of that stopped what was already in motion. Subpoenas don't care where you hide. The final blow of Part 2 came on a Friday afternoon. Investigators executed a formal seizure of HOA records from Karen's home office. Neighbors watched from porches as officials carried boxes to unmarked vehicles. Karen stood in the doorway, rigid, her confidence completely gone. She didn't look powerful anymore. She looked small, cornered, exposed. That night, a notice went out to the community. Karen Hollis was suspended from all HOA duties pending the outcome of the investigation. The board would appoint interim leadership. The language was clinical, restrained, but the meaning was unmistakable. Karen's reign was over. Emily cried when she read it, not out of triumph, but release. Weeks of fear drained away all at once. I held her and felt the same. But even as relief settled in, I knew the story wasn't finished. Suspension was not justice. Exposure was not accountability. Karen had caused real harm, and systems move slowly. Part 3 would not be about power slipping away. It would be about consequences finally arriving. Karen had lost control of the HOA. She had not yet faced what she'd done. Karen's suspension should have ended the tension, but instead it revealed just how deeply she had embedded herself into every corner of Brookstone Ridge. The interim board moved quickly, issuing reassurances, promising transparency, and urging residents to remain calm. Yet calm is hard to reclaim after prolonged fear. People kept looking over their shoulders, half expecting Karen to reappear with a clipboard and a smirk, as if authority was something she could simply pick back up again. Emily tried to focus on healing. The baby's doctor was pleased with his progress, and each follow-up appointment brought cautious optimism. Still, the psychological weight lingered. Stress doesn't evaporate when the threat pauses, it leaves residue. Some nights, Emily woke suddenly, convinced she'd heard footsteps outside. I would check the cameras, reassure her, and sit with her until sleep returned. Karen might have been suspended, but the damage she caused hadn't been undone. The board's first discovery came from the financials. As soon as Karen's access was cut off, discrepancies surfaced. Fines that had been collected but never properly allocated. Legal expenses approved without votes. Vendor payments routed through accounts no one recognized. The board members, now visibly alarmed, contacted the investigators again, this time as complainants rather than subjects. That shift mattered. It reframed the situation from rogue leadership to systemic exploitation. Karen's attorney finally made contact, issuing a sharply worded letter accusing the HOA and several residents, including us, of defamation and conspiracy. Our attorney responded calmly, attaching documentation, timestamps, and legal citations. The reply shut the threats down quickly. Lawyers understand evidence, and Karen's case was collapsing under its own weight. The next escalation came from Karen herself. Despite suspension orders, she sent a mass email from her personal account, accusing the board of betrayal and residents of mob behavior. She claimed she'd been framed and hinted at secrets she could reveal if pushed further. The tone was unstable, oscillating between righteous anger and desperate pleading. The board forwarded the email to investigators immediately. That message alone demonstrated why she'd been removed. Neighbors who once avoided confrontation began speaking openly. One organized a meeting in her living room to discuss reforms. Another proposed dissolving the HOA entirely. Attendance was high. Fear had turned into resolve. People shared stories long buried, realizing how many of them had been targeted at moments of vulnerability. Karen hadn't just enforced rules, she'd curated fear. And fear, once named, loses its grip. Emily attended one of those gatherings briefly, the baby cradled close. People greeted her gently, apologized quietly, some with tears. She accepted the apologies without bitterness. "We all did what we thought we had to," she said later. "But now we know better." That understanding felt like the beginning of healing, not just for us, but for the entire street. Karen made one last attempt to insert herself into our lives. She filed a personal restraining request against me, claiming harassment. The judge reviewed the evidence, including recordings and timelines, and dismissed it outright. The dismissal was swift and public. Karen's credibility evaporated completely. The judge's remarks were measured but firm, noting a pattern of vexatious conduct and misuse of authority. Those words echoed far beyond the courtroom. The investigators concluded their fieldwork shortly after. They informed us that formal findings would follow, along with recommendations for penalties and potential civil action. They couldn't discuss specifics, but their tone suggested Karen's problems were far from over. As they left, one investigator said quietly, "This didn't start with you, but it may end because of you." I understood what he meant. Systems often tolerate abuse until someone documents it thoroughly enough to force change. Life in Brookstone Ridge slowly began to normalize. Violation notices stopped entirely. The interim board rescinded several fines, including ours. They approved medical accommodations retroactively and issued an apology, both private and public. It didn't erase what happened, but it mattered. Accountability, even partial, has weight. Karen's house sat dark most nights. Rumors circulated that she was preparing to sell, that she couldn't show her face without hostility. I felt no satisfaction in that. What I felt was closure inching closer, though not complete. Justice, I'd learned, is rarely dramatic. It's procedural, slow, and relentless. As part 2 ended, Emily and I sat on the porch one evening, the baby sleeping peacefully between us. The street was quiet, not tense quiet, but ordinary quiet. For the first time since we moved in, it felt safe. Yet we both knew part 3 would be different. Investigations lead to findings. Findings lead to consequences. And consequences, once formalized, have a way of reshaping lives permanently. Karen Hollis had lost her position, her influence, and her shield. What she hadn't yet lost was accountability.